On October 13, 1947, inside a B-17 bomber flying 415 miles east of Jacksonville, Florida, scientists opened the cargo hatch and dumped 80 kilograms of crushed dry ice into the clouds below. They were testing a theory. They were about to change the course of a hurricane, or so they would later believe. The man behind the experiment was Irving Langmuir. He had won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1932. He worked for General Electric and spent decades studying how water molecules move through clouds. Langmuir was not a man who doubted himself. He believed that clouds could be seeded, that frozen particles dropped into the right spot could trigger a chain reaction, crystallizing the moisture, forcing the system to collapse from within. With him on the project were Vincent Schaefer and Bernard Vonnegut, both brilliant researchers. Vonnegut's brother, Kurt, would later become a famous novelist, but in 1947, Bernard was focused on the physics of freezing. Together, they had run experiments in laboratories. They had flown over smaller clouds and seeded them with success. The theory worked at small scale. Now they wanted to test it on something real, something that covered thousands of square miles, something that could kill people. Hurricane King was grinding up the Atlantic coast in October 1947. It was a major storm, powerful, organized, deadly. The official experiment was sponsored by the U.S. Army Signal Corps. The goal was not reckless. It was logical, even noble. If they could weaken a hurricane by seeding its clouds with dry ice, if they could make it dissipate or lose power before it struck land, then they would save lives. They would prove that human beings could negotiate with nature, could reach up into the sky and change the outcome of the weather itself. The dry ice fell into the clouds at 2,500 feet. The temperature in those clouds was around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Dry ice is much colder, 78 degrees below zero. When the particles fell through the moisture, the theory predicted they would act as nucleation sites. Water vapor would freeze onto them. The cloud would crystallize. The precipitation would fall. The storm would lose energy. Physics would do the rest. But something went wrong, or something went right, depending on your perspective. Within a few hours, Hurricane King did something meteorologically unusual. It reversed direction. Not slightly, not a minor wobble. It made a hard 135-degree turn to the left. It had been tracking northeast, away from land, heading out into the open Atlantic where it would eventually weaken and dissipate over cold water. After the seeding, it turned due west. It turned inland. On October 15, 1947, Hurricane King made landfall near Ossabaw Island, about 15 miles south of Savannah, Georgia. The storm struck at full strength. The wind tore roofs from houses. A woman died, the only direct fatality, but a death nonetheless. Across Georgia and South Carolina, the storm destroyed about 1,500 structures. The damage totaled $3.26 million in 1947 currency. Adjusted for inflation to modern times, that would be over $50 million. Every home that was destroyed, every family that lost everything, had one pressing question: had the scientists done this? Irving Langmuir seemed to answer yes. He told reporters that he was 99% certain the seeding had caused the turn. Not 90%, not 95%, 99%. He was confessing, in effect. He was saying that he and his team had reached into the sky, and the sky had obeyed them, with terrible consequences. The public exploded in outrage. Lawsuits were threatened. Newspapers ran headlines about scientists playing God with the weather. Families who had lost their homes called for accountability. A woman was dead. A storm had changed course. And the man who might have caused it was telling everyone he believed he had. But then the investigation began. The U.S. Weather Bureau assigned meteorologists to pull historical records. They went back through decades of hurricane data, storms from the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. They were looking for precedent. Had other hurricanes ever made sharp turns like the one Hurricane King had made? Had other storms ever reversed direction and tracked inland without any human interference? Had nature ever done this on its own? The answer was yes. Again and again, the historical records showed hurricanes making similar turns. Sharp, 130-degree reversals. Storms that had been heading out to sea suddenly pivoting inland. This was not exotic behavior. This was not a signature of seeding. This was simply what hurricanes sometimes did. The dry ice had fallen into the clouds. The hurricane had turned. But the turn was meteorologically plausible on its own. The scientists, it seemed, had done nothing. The experiment had failed in the most literal sense. The dry ice had not changed the storm. Yet the scientists could never be fully exonerated. The Weather Bureau's historical analysis was compelling, but it was not proof. Meteorology in 1947 was not sophisticated enough to reconstruct the counterfactual. There was no way to know with absolute certainty what Hurricane King would have done if the dry ice had never fallen. The woman in Georgia was still dead. The 1,500 homes were still destroyed. And somewhere in that gap between scientific innocence and moral responsibility, the real disaster lived. Project Cirrus became a warning, not because the seeding worked and caused catastrophe, but because the seeding failed and catastrophe happened anyway. The lesson was not about the physics of cloud seeding. It was about hubris and humility. Langmuir had been 99% certain. He had been willing to gamble with a real hurricane over the Atlantic. No scientist since then has ever made that mistake twice. Weather modification research continued for decades in the laboratory, in computer models, in small-scale cloud experiments. But after Cirrus, no one tried again on a major hurricane without understanding the full scope of what could go wrong. The cost of being 99% certain had been paid in Georgia. The lesson had been learned in the wreckage.